Sorry, I tease a lot. We're all right. So, okay. So just a quick couple of reminders. This morning, good morning, everyone. This morning we have Dr. Anna Nelson with us. She is the director for the Center of Excellence in Social Work for New Mexico Highlands University. Please share a warm welcome with her this morning. And I just want to give a real quick couple of reminders. Please make sure to have your cameras on. I want to see everyone. If you have that capability, I understand, internet can be an issue, connectivity, all of that stuff. So, but if you can, please do. And if you have anything you want to share with her, please feel free to use the chat. We also have Jennifer Espinosa Ruiz for any technical support. She's put in her information into the chat. Just another quick reminders to please keep yourself on mute while we have the presentation going, and you can use the raise hand function, and Anna will talk to us more about any other specific guidance she wants to share with us. So I'm so glad everyone returned, and I'm just looking through the list one more time before we get started. All right.
Well, good morning, everyone. Ton, thank you so much for that warm introduction, and it's just really an honor to be here. And truly, I feel like this is an opportunity to come home to you all. I've really enjoyed over a few decades now, I think, being able to collaborate with OSAP and to be able to be out in community with you all. And so this is, again, a true honor and blessing to be able to come into this space with you. And I do not see my PowerPoint. Is it my turn to go? Let's see.
Are we all set and ready? I can share that for you.
Oh,
perfect. Okay. So today, so what is really, this again, in thinking through this 3 hours that we're able to spend together, this is an opportunity really for us to be in community and in dialogue together. I am a person who I do not consider it rude to be asking questions during my presentation. I may speed us up a little bit if we get to be a little delayed or change the activities a little bit. But my goal really is to be here and be present and talk about some, I think, concepts that I think we know just from our lived expertise and our identities, and, just the nature of the work that we do. Sometimes these concepts, it's what we do, right? And the way in which I hope to bring it to you today is sort of in a package that you can go and maybe figure out areas where you can deepen these practices a little bit. So, I had the honor of joining you all in a previous meeting and was only able to join you for a short period of time. So these 3 hours are to take the idea of building sustainable, healing-centered, and decolonized practices to the next level, to the community out in our work, right? So it's taking these ideas, right, and actually putting them into practice. And to me, the best way always to do that is when we're in community and connecting with each other. And so I'm on it. I have been, so I identify as mixed Latina. So my mother was Latina, my father is Anglo. And, I always kind of open this space up, especially when I'm in community with folks working on healing practices around substance use. So my mother did experience addiction, and she did pass away from an overdose. And so a lot of the work that I do was through, the lens of a child and a young person and a loved one of someone who was impacted by addiction, and ultimately lost their lives because of it. So that gives you a little bit of a sense of this is who I am, and this is, why I do this work. So I just recently made a transition from New Mexico State University now to again, I'm talking about coming back home, right? So I'm an alum of New Mexico Highlands University, and now I had the honor of being able to come back and do this work at the Center for Excellence, which is a statewide center to support not just social work, but behavioral health. And I work really closely with the Native American Social Work Studies Institute here at Highlands as well. And then we have a Sweet Raíces program, which is really this whole continuum of really amazing, culturally grounded, identity grounded work that's happening. So I also bring that context into this dialogue today. So thank you for allowing me to give a little bit and share a little bit about who I am and why I'm here in this space with you all. So next slide, please. I also always feel it's important to do a land and labor acknowledgement. And there are a couple of prefaces that I wanted to mention today. So first and foremost, I offer this land and labor acknowledgement to the members of the 23 tribes and pueblos here in New Mexico as traditional stewards of these unceded lands, and recognize the impact of slavery and colonization on African, Asian, Indigenous, and Mexican peoples whose forced labor created this specific space in which we hold this conversation today. This violent impact of enslavement, colonization, and genocide, persists, right? And that's actually why we're having this conversation about decolonizing our practices. And it's not solely historical, but it is here with us today. So it's just in radical acknowledgement that a lot of harm has happened and a lot of healing needs to occur. And this is just one small step in my commitment to ensure that I'm really practicing and walking racial truth telling and promoting reconciliation in any space that I can. I'd also like to share that I'm not an expert. So when I first got this opportunity to join you all, I was like, oh, decolonizing practices. Okay. So I want to just come from a really humble place and say, this is, I'm a lifelong learner in this space, right? And so some of the concepts that I bring to you today, they are definitely not my own. And these are more concepts for us as community to think through collectively and how we can put this into practice. And then I just mentioned that I just wanted to dedicate this presentation to my mother who passed from an overdose. So next slide, please. Okay, so a lot of you probably have been in a space with me, and you may even have been in a classroom with me and be like, Anna, you're going to make me do this again. But I really love community agreements because we're in dialogue about some tough topics, right? Some really painful. We're talking about racism. We're talking about homophobia and transphobia and oppression. And we're talking about some really deep things that are hard. And we're going to talk a little bit about something called moral injury, which is something I've been noticing out in community. And man, that's painful to talk about because it's like when you trust and when you share a common dream and a common aspiration with someone and that person commits harm against you, what does that do to you in terms of your your sense of safety? And so we're going to get into that a little bit today, a little bit more deeply. Those are painful topics to talk about, especially in a big group. So I'm going to make us do this thing one more time, which is community agreements. And it's something that I love to do because this is something, so my clinical expertise is in adolescent behavioral health and culturally relevant trauma-informed stuff. And every time I'm in a group context, these community agreements are necessary because this is how we don't perpetuate harm against each other. So it's an activity, it's a consensus-driven activity to help us to know what do we need from each other in order to feel safe, to be curious, to feel creative, to not feel like this sense of, oh my gosh, overwhelmed, right? Like this sense of like, this is so much. So, really helping us to be connected with one another. So what I'm going to ask you to do here in the next couple of minutes is just to answer the question for me. What do you need from me as this dialogue facilitator and from our co-learners together in this space to feel curious and safe during the next couple hours together? So go ahead and throw that in the chat, and then I'll kind of clarify things if I'm curious about something. So just go for it. Go in the chat and say what you need to feel curious and safe and comfortable in this space. There we go. Oh, yes, Carla, absolutely. Absolutely. Breather breaks, Michelle, you do you when you need a break, and we will do some breaks. Yes. Oh, thank you. Being authentic, being curious, being inquisitive. I love that. Good skill development and knowledge. So today is more about skill building, right? And so, yes, Bernie, I respect that. I respect that 100%. Voluntary contributions. And you know what, Bernie, that gives me pause for thought, right? Like, only share what you feel safe in sharing, and don't feel pressed to do beyond that. Water, yes. Grounding ourselves in water. Absolutely. Okay. Humor. Yes, humor is a good thing. So I'll try and keep it fresh the whole 3 hours. So okay. So so as we go on, some of the things that often come up is, when we're thinking about these critical conversations, and feel free to continue in the chat. One of the biggest pieces is, this space is intended to be a space free from judgment. Okay, so when we have questions, no question is, please feel free to just put your questions out there, but also to know that who you are and what you bring to this dialogue today is super valuable. So honoring the value of your lived expertise and everything that you bring to this space is really important. And what that means is we don't are kind of agreeing not to be judgmental toward one another, and to kind of bring our whole selves into this space. So an elder once told me, or asked me this question that has stuck with me for, I'm talking years, like a couple decades. But an elder asked me this question one time, Anna, are you acting from memory, or are you acting from inspiration? And I really sat and I thought about that for a minute. And what that means to me is not bringing, our, like, what's on our plate at work to the table, not bringing these preconceived notions or these assumptions about folks to the table, and coming from a space of inspiration and what really catches you, and what you really resonate and connect with. So that's sometimes an agreement that I kind of throw out there is, let's try and act from inspiration when we can. Another piece is, through these 3 hours, I hope to earn some trust with you, that even when we get into deep critical dialogue, that we can talk it through, right? And that I can facilitate through this. So I've been doing this for, I think now 27 years. And so I hope that I bring some skill sets to this conversation. So let's go ahead and continue on. And we've got a few good ground rules today, or community agreements. I prefer that. So there are so many whys about, back to Bernie's point about this is not a safe time, right? This is literally not a safe time. There are so many competing presses, right? Like, there are so many things that are happening right now that are equally urgent, equally equally scary, equally threatening, right? There are a lot of external forces right now that are trying, really honestly, this is kind of my worldview, trying to to preserve the structures and institutions that exist right now that can be very oppressive, or not can be, are oppressive. I'll just be real about it. And so what we're dealing with is an onslaught, an assault almost of an erosion of the few rights and opportunities that are out there for Black, Indigenous, and communities of color and LGBT folk, right? Like there's this straight assault on that. So it is not a safe time. And so that's one of the major reasons I'm coming in this space today. Also, there is a lot of data out there. So sometime I'll bring research and different things in to our conversation so that, we know a little bit about where some of this information comes from. But, it's important first and foremost always to acknowledge we are a state that is, we are so fortunate to be able to come together in multiple communities of color, tribes, pueblos, multiple communities coming together in ways that other states nationally do not experience, right? So we are one of 6 states nationally who we are a majority of Black, Indigenous, and communities of color. And what that means is and behavioral health organizations are often populated by primarily Anglo folks, right? So what that means is there's a lot of work to be done and to be had about how do we bridge a sense of awareness and humility and culturally grounded practices in a state where, there may be some disparities in the workforce and there may be lack of representation in the workforce. So, and then, we have to sort of radically acknowledge this. Mental health practices are fundamentally within systems of power and colonial hegemony. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But the idea here is that this whole conversation, this dialogue kind of is summarized in this really cool quote about mental health experiences of Black, Indigenous, and people of color and communities. And I would also say LGBT communities are characterized by disconnections from ancestral culture and land due to colonization, alienation from culturally and spiritually grounded mental health practices, racial trauma, intersecting oppression. And that's where, when I uplift LGBT identities, I'm also saying, we don't exist in a bubble, right? We are, we have an identity, we have multiple identities. And so in our work, we always want to be thinking about how does this person move through the world? What is, how are they what do they experience out in community based on all these intersecting identities? And then, the body of my research is really about, again, this is all stuff community already knows. It's all stuff you already know. And the benefit of like doing the research is to be able to give it space and voice in a different way, in a different space. So yeah, we look to the science and we look to the literature, and literature is telling us, the research is showing that racism and oppression, especially microaggressions, racism, sexism, and homophobia, there's a correlation between risk for trauma. And I also always want to pause right here, because when I start talking about trauma, when I start talking about trauma, it's difficult and painful, right? And when you think about, okay, Anna, you're talking about something I live through every single day. So does that mean I'm walking around constantly traumatized? And what I want to say is, no, that's one of the significant pieces about our dialogue today, is that when we're exposed to trauma, we have foundations and we have history and we have tradition and we have ways in which we heal. So it's it's looking at things in a totally different way. So, sort of a westernized vision of thinking about trauma is like, you go through this exposure and then there you go, you're traumatized and now you got to, do all the trauma things, right? And that actually is not the case. And that's not the way in which we experience life. We experience life through, we have experiences of exposure to trauma. We have experiences of healing. We have experiences of really reaching into our roots and our identity and grounding ourselves. We have experiences of loved ones coming around us to help us heal, right? So it's not just this like linear narrative that people think all the time of trauma. So I just wanted to share a little bit about that. And we, we have to keep this conversation alive, because that narrative of trauma does not ever talk about what the healing practices that we bring, right? So it talks about all this deficit, all of this sort of like, thought of, now you will have a pathology or a symptom or a thing, right? Or you'll have these worsening outcomes. And what we're doing today in community is introducing a totally different, what we call counter story, right? We want to tell a different story, and we want to say, we're going to talk about community, cultural capital and cultural wealth, right? We're going to talk about how that is curative and healing, and how it's also protective. So, and when you do experience traumatic effect, these things still exist, right? They're still present. So how do we as practitioners out in community addressing substance use or addressing the prevention of substance use, how do we bring that into our space? And how are we looking for that and uplifting that in the people and communities who we serve? So that's my why. So next slide, please. So that's my why. And I talked a lot. And also, I'm knowing that. So, one thing that was kind of a little bit of a, I wasn't sure how to really balance this. So some of us have been together in dialogue talking about some of these things. So I'm bringing new information to the table, but I'm also wanting to make sure that those of us who didn't have the previous conversation have an opportunity to kind of, get these foundational pieces, and then we're going to dig a little bit deeper. But I'm curious to know, like, if you want to share your why and what, and what connects you with this work, or what is your hope from learning today? So I saw skill building in the chat earlier, but I'm curious about what are some other people's thoughts and hopes about today's conversation. Bernie, yes, white power, terrorism, white supremacy. Yes. Yes. Healing and hope. To Joseph, thank you so much. To confront my personal biases, and and we all have them, and that's a lifelong healing process, right? We all were experienced exposure to some level of social programming, right? And so I appreciate your courage in sharing that. More about decolonizing practices, enhancing some skills, and continuing to support our communities. How to assist the healing of others. I love that. And there's also healing practices associated with PTSD and how to. So I'm going to introduce or talk about some of the things that have really worked for me in my healing practices when I'm out doing this work. And so I'm definitely going to, be able to share a little bit and talk more about that. And then skill building, learning more about myself. Yes. So there's time for introspection in this dialogue today. Improving communication and understanding. So Antoinette, that's great, because I also have communication skills, right? So yay. So that's part of this too. Personal and professional development, tangible, doable actions. Yes. Okay. So Paula, Paula, we used to know each other a long time ago. I think we worked together like 1,000 years ago. It's so cool to connect. Hey, so anyways, we're going to get with the tools, and then I hope we have time at the end to do tangible action steps and how to support communities with this vision in a substantive way. So I love all of that. So yeah, let's get going then, because we got a lot to cover, and I hope to kind of really do justice to all of that. So next slide, please. Okay, so so this is just sort of goals that you always have to put in a presentation, but essentially I want us to really walk out with some skills, and I want us to understand critical trauma theory a little bit better and how it connects with decolonizing healing centered practices. And then I also, just want us to, I do really hope that we, toward the end of the dialogue today, that we can just press pause, reflect, and get some action steps. So I brought a tool with me today that I want to go a little bit more deeply into. I think I introduced it last time, but I don't think we had any time really to take a look at it. So today I'm hoping we can do that. Yes. Oh, thank you. Yes, Bernie. Yeah, so it's real, and there needs to be space to be able to have these conversations. And then, Joanna, you mentioned about not isolate groups of people for not being of color. Everyone has their concerns and experiences. We live in such a mixed population. Yes, okay. So, really understanding that while we center Black, Indigenous, and communities of color, we are all a community collectively, right? And that centeredness is in a quest for balance and justice and equity, but that no one should be excluded. So I honor and appreciate that very much. Okay, so next slide, please. Okay, so this is where, let's everybody like settle in, take a big deep breath. I was thinking about this, and I was thinking, I hope that the imagery that I share is really more in honor of losses and the impact certain things have had in our communities, rather than evoking any strong feelings. I always want you all to know that you can step away, come back, and if you ever just need to like press pause and be like, Anna, we need to walk through something, I'm happy to do so. I'm also always happy to stay after if you guys have time and you need to move through some stuff, but this is where we kind of dig into some difficult topics. So just kind of a little, here we go. So next slide, please. Okay, so colonization, colonization is what we feel at a soul level. So that, there's wordy definitions here, but my understanding and my lived experience in very small ways in comparison to my loved ones and colleagues, colonization is really about the forcible experience of being taken from the traditions, the language, the things that fuel and feed us, the stories that keep us whole and help us to understand from where we come, right? Like it's the forcible removal of all of that, which comes from generations and gives us the strength in the now, right? And so that's kind of how I think about colonization, or I should say the impact of colonization. Colonization is a violent act by nature, right? It evokes genocide, it evokes violence, right? And it evokes violence as a form of suppression. So some of the definitions here, it's really about forcibly establishing control over and subjugating Indigenous populations and also populations of color. I think about colonization, there's a lot about capital, I don't want to go too deep, but there's a lot about, capitalism and its role in perpetuating colonization. So there's a lot of sort of modern day ways in which colonization continues and persists, right? So it's the appropriation of land, resources, and culture for the purposes of domination and control through acts of violence, enslavement, genocide. This includes intimate partner violence. It includes sexual violence. It includes loss of life. It includes police use of lethal force. It includes all of those pieces. And the status of the colonizer is protected through systems of control that are embedded in social institutions. So when we feel that sense of unsafety, right, like we don't feel safe, when we feel that like press that there are so many things happening right now, know that that lived experience is true, and it's also shared among so many. And that's why being in a safe space right now and just really, being able to have these conversations is so meaningful, because it's a space for you to just kind of drop your shoulders, take a breath, know that my hope is that you will know that you will not experience an attack in this space, right? So, just having this conversation is a radical step. And it's a way of self-preservation. And so I just appreciate being able to share that. And so when we start talking about these things, that's where it gets a little like, oh, this is, we feel this stuff every single day. And contemporary systems of behavioral health practices can be traced directly to European colonization, social work among that, right? So social workers have linkages to boarding schools, to forcible removal of children, to forcible sterilization of Indigenous women. Social workers played a role in that. And if nobody's talking about it, nobody's healing about it, right? So it's just important for us to have that space to, be real and speak the truth. So next slide, please. Okay, so like I mentioned, that multiple definitions exist. My PowerPoints are always super wordy, and I'm super sorry for that. It's more like you could just take it home and read it someday, like when you really need to like go to sleep or something. So I'm so sorry about that. And so it's just there for you as more of a resource. But two things happen around colonization and the process of decolonizing, right? So it's both an event and a process. So it's about reaching a level of critical consciousness and an active understanding of who you are and the ways in which you experience colonization, right? And that's body sovereignty, that's food sovereignty, that's land and water sovereignty. It's all of it, right? And how then, because we've been exposed to colonization, that then changes the ways in which we experience life, right? And so life circumstances are externally controlled at a lot of times. So that's the event, right? And then the process is really about engaging in activities of creating. So my love in life is art, and any type of art, any kind of thing, spoken word, photography, any of it, as a means for healing. So finding that space for creativity is really important, and it's a healing process. It's a very powerful healing way of going through this. But creating also means birthing new ideas, right? And also creating literally means, birthing and being able to create a space where children grow in a safe environment and are loved and are able to feel like they belong and that they matter, right? So creating means so much in this context. And then restoration, as well as here birthing, right? It means creating and consciously using various strategies to liberate ourselves. And that's going to be, when we get a little bit further into the dialogue, that's going to be where we do a little bit of reflection, and we really think about what is it that we need to do in our own lived experiences. What are healing practices we need to put into place? And we do talk about, being radically committing to a whole spectrum of self and collective care. And part of that is internal truth telling, right? Like, what is really happening for us that we need, I was just thinking about this the other day. I've got some stuff that I need to heal from, right? Like just, in the recent few years. And I was just reflecting on that actually while I was trying to prepare for this. And I was thinking, healing also means being really real and authentic, and like what do we need internally to handle our business, right? So it is a process of internal reflection as well as external action. And so then so what does it look like to restore those cultural practices, the ways of knowing, the ways of thinking, beliefs, values, excuse me, that were abandoned, but are still incredibly important and relevant, and will be relevant for generations to come, not just right now. Right now we should be looking to our elders to teach us in times of this intensity of struggle, what has helped us continue to not just thrive, but to heal. And ultimately we then ease into that space and help generations coming up in the ways that we want to support folks. And so bringing back what we know is healing and restorative, and what breathes life into everything that we do. And it also, I mentioned, requires ongoing critical reflectivity as well as action. And so I'll go ahead and go to the next slide. Okay. So what does it look like in the space that we're doing in terms of substance use prevention and treatment, right? So again, big ideas, and then how do you kind of bring it to something that's more pragmatic and practical? And so, I'll give some techniques in a little bit, but broadly, what we're talking about is embracing an understanding of how ethno-racial and collective traumas have a direct they are a direct extension of colonization, and they impact mental health outcomes. And so, when we have that knowledge and awareness, we also want to bring in the knowledge and awareness of what are the healing, restorative aspects that every person brings to the space. And I have had so many conversations where people, especially people who've really, struggled without adequate supports, and they're out there in community doing this work sort of solo, and they're just like soldiering through because there's so much need and so much work. And I've heard people say it literally, Anna, I don't know, like sometimes I experience a person and it doesn't seem like they bring any kind of knowledge of their own identities or anything to the table. And, when I have that conversation, I always think, well, that's a beautiful opportunity to connect, to create community and connect those folks to people who can help them to learn about their identities and who they are, and how that can then be a strength for healing. So every person has a gift, right? Every person comes to this with a gift. And we just need to, act from inspiration and really not, and really create that space for that person to express or explore that gift. So also radically acknowledging the entrenched historical and present day relationships among our professions. So that means teachers, that means social workers, that means behavioral health folk, that means state folk, that all of us, right? Among our professions and carceral systems like law enforcement, child protective services, juvenile justice, some spaces of substance use treatment, right? So it's like really being mindful about, especially sometimes the work that we do is mandated by the court, right? And like we have to kind of navigate, what does that mean when someone is not necessarily voluntarily engaging in this healing, right? So beginning with that, and then commit to dismantling systemic and institutional racism within our professions, and honor and make space for multiple ways of knowing, as well as creating culturally affirming and meaningful healing spaces. And then one of the things that, one of the reasons I'm so excited to have this new job is because I get to, it's like it's like, I don't know, it's like Christmas for me or whatever, because I get to actually explore and figure out more about culturally relevant assessments and interventions and make sure they're out in community. Like I get paid to go like figure this stuff out together collectively with you all. So using those culturally relevant assessments and interventions, this one's tough, right? Because how do we pay our bills? We pay our bills often through insurance or through other funding sources that have these strict requirements that are really Eurocentric. So how do you kind of navigate through that? And have those tough conversations at your organizational level to say, we're forced to use this one tool and it's tested for a particular population that's not our community. So how do we bring in practice-based evidence? How do we elevate that, right? So that's another thing that I hope the center will get to do is research that elevates these community best practice, what we know in community that is traditional wisdom, and create that pipeline for funding, right? So anyways, I get excited about that stuff. And then promote collective healing rather than solely focusing on sort of individual outcomes. So it's telling a different story. It's that counter narrative. It's not just about one and done, right? Like it's about, you have to think about that whole person, their family, their community. And when we promote healing practices, in this way, we're healing generations and we're healing communities versus, looking at the person right in front of us. Okay. Oh, and thanks, Valerie, that you like my nerdy wordiness. Thanks. I know everybody else is like, it's too big. Like, I can't tell you. And I don't know, it's like a thing that I can't get over. Like my PowerPoints are always so many words. So I apologize about that. Okay, next slide. Like people always are like, on it, less words. I'm like, I know, but I can't. Okay, so this is where, so again, telling a different narrative. So when I speak about this, I always have to really kind of slow my roll and acknowledge, right, that trauma, every person experiences traumatic experiences differently. Their healing looks different for each person. There's no one standard way of when you've had a trauma exposure or multiple trauma exposures. There's no expectation you should be healed at a certain point, or if a person struggles with that lived experience or those lived experiences across a lifespan, we're still going to be there and be, and surround them with support and caring, right? Regardless of their, how they move through their trauma trajectory, right? So I always just want to start there because sometimes folks, when I start talking about this, they're like, well, what about a person who, has just had a horrible trauma and they're just trying to struggle day by day, right? All of this is to say that is a very real lived experience. And also there are many other experiences with trauma that are rarely, if ever, talked about. And so I want to create that space to have a different dialogue about the way that we perceive trauma and the different ways that trauma comes at us. And so what this part of the conversation is about is changing that narrative from individual to cumulative, collective, and cultural forms of trauma. So that's a little, framework for these types of trauma. And so what I gave to you here, and this is something that I think I introduced last time, but I just want to make sure that you all have it. These are, the different types of trauma that I really delve into and want to understand and really explore more. So I think I'm just going to highlight a few of them that to me are what we in community are experiencing here in New Mexico a lot. So collective traumas. So, one of the things that I'll speak on in a second is a little bit about environmental racism and how this is creating collective traumas through climate change and disproportional impact and different things. But the idea of a collective experience with trauma is that we are, as community, as families, as as we're connected right through our identities, we collectively go through political assaults, this just rapid decline of any kind of social safety, any kind of perception of a social safety net. Like everything seems to be falling, down around us, right? We're all going through it. And what that means is sometimes that erodes our connections with each other. Sometimes it brings us all together really strongly in solidarity. And sometimes that is less possible because we're on the grind, right? We're just trying to struggle to make it day by day. So when I think about collective trauma, it actually makes us less of a collective often when we go through it, right? We experience it similarly, not ever the same, but similarly. And then we start to because we need to make it day by day, we start to pull away from each other. So when a collective traumatic exposure happens, that's when, again, us doing this work out in community need to come together to help people heal together, right? So that we can progress and move forward versus separate and sort of get stuck in this lived experience. So that to me is something that's really important to mention about collective. It's something I've been observing, and I haven't really talked about that before, but those are some of the observations I've been having. And the reason I'm talking about this today is we are going to talk a little bit about environmental disasters and its relationship to substance use. And, we just barely, are still struggling through impact from the pandemic. That right there we're going to see that impact for generations to come. That's another thing about collective trauma is a lot of time it follows us from generation to generation. So what we just endured, and in many ways still endure in certain areas, it's going to persist for generations. And so how do we heal from that? And then, communal trauma, similar to collective trauma, the thing I wanted to highlight about this one's really powerful in terms of, these are just different ways to express these lived experiences. So communal trauma, why I love that, why I love learning about that and sort of seeing that is it's a counter narrative to victimhood. And what I'm meaning by that, so here's a powerful quote. So a harm or wrongdoing against a targeted racialized group so horrendous that it induces a traumatic condition. So literally we could just sit quietly and think of multiple examples of this just in the recent few years, right? These traumatic conditions exist and evolve in our collective memories of racialized harms and wrongs tied to shared identity, experience, and place, and is worked through in everyday consciousness. So again, that impacts how we heal, how we self-medicate, how we interact with each other, all of it. And then communal trauma is not victimhood. It's a legitimate response to harm and wrongdoing. And that's the part I feel is powerful. Because when we think about that, we're like, okay, there's these certain things that externally could be labeled pathologically. And often it is a really normalized response to horrendous, horrible conditions, right? So, when I think about non-judgment, communal trauma comes up for me as a way to reframe how we perceive people and possibly behaviors, right, in certain settings. So to me, that's super powerful. And then I'm going to skip over these other ones because I'll just kind of pause quickly on cultural trauma. I'm just going to pause real quick here. It's very similar again to communal trauma, but what's important to again know about cultural trauma, so when I think what's the difference between communal and cultural? Communal, again, shared identity, but it's sort of more present day. Cultural trauma is something that is historical, intergenerational, and present day, right? Like, so it's got that full continuum of lived experience. So, my Nana experienced a thing, right? My mother and my aunties experienced a thing. I experience a thing, my child might also experience that same thing. Thinking, so that's how I kind of tell the difference between communal and cultural. And so, and a lot of what we're going through, again, like community violence, that happens, I think about, my community and where I live and the violence that happens and the legacy that leaves. And, and then what happens to the generations coming up when there's been significant losses, mass shootings, police use of lethal force, border closings, those all could be both communal and cultural, but it's leaving this legacy, right, across time, where it may have happened 20 years ago, but we still feel it, or it may happen 50 years ago, or 100 or 200 years ago, we still are feeling the effect. Okay, next slide. Yeah, Josephine, I wish we could have a class for young people too. That would be so awesome. I would love that. I'd love to, my favorite thing is talking with young people, right? Like, and getting real like this and really listening to their experiences. I feel like I learn way more than I ever, bring to the table in conversations like that. Yes, state-sponsored violence for more than 400 years. Absolutely. That is cultural trauma. And then I always talk about this, and again, I know some of you have heard this part, but it probably bears repeating, which is that, so Maria Yellow Horse Braveheart did something so powerful in giving voice to the experience of historical trauma. But what is never really talked about is, so that definition of historical trauma, you see it in textbooks, you see it like all this like westernized spaces, but what's never brought simultaneously is her intent to always speak about intergenerational resilience when you're talking about historical trauma. And that's never paired together. And it's so important because her intent was never to say, this cumulative emotional, psychological wounding over a lifespan is going to break us, right? That was never her intent. Her intent was to say, we need to honor and acknowledge the existence of this while also honoring and acknowledging intergenerational resilience. She taught me a lot about, her wisdom and her words are brought into the space when we talk about critical trauma theory. So how she defines historical trauma is the idea of cumulative emotional and psychological wounding over the lifespan and across generations, emanating from massive group trauma, compounded by discrimination, present day discrimination, racism, and oppression. And immediately she says, while this exists, there is no denying that intergenerational resilience also exists, right? So there's no denying that fact. So I did want to throw that out there. And then there's, ethno-racial and oppression-based trauma. So ethno-racial trauma was put forward. Again, that's already stuff we know, but it really kind of got into the literature in about 2019. And at the same time, here in New Mexico, we were writing about oppression-based trauma, thinking through all those intersections, right? So where we identify first as from our cultural perspectives, we also identify with these other intersecting marginalized identities. So, that it's neat how sometimes, we need the words and they kind of emerge simultaneously. And so that's a little bit about the history there. And we'll go to the next slide now. Okay, we're going to take a break, just so hang tough with me. We're going to take a break here in just a minute, just so that we can get a little bit of a breather, and then we'll come back and do a little breakout activity. A couple of things. So I want to pause on this slide, because this one's also a tough thing to swallow, because we're always looking for, language has so much power, and we're always looking for ways to support folks and really honor them and look for, the strengths or the points of resilience and things like that. And so when I then bring up this whole idea of resilience fatigue, people are like, Anna, quit with that, because we just barely got that language out there of resilience, right? So it's okay to uplift people's resilience. At the same time, it's also incredibly important for us to understand that that can be a struggle, that constantly having, I had mentioned that, I was just in reflection as I was kind of preparing for today's conversation. Like my little resilience, like I'm tapped out, man. So this makes sense to me about resilience fatigue. I'm like, man, like I so get this right now. The idea of exhaustion that comes from a prolonged period of struggle and coping and, trying to manage my stress and all this stuff. But it's also a long period of struggle with exposure to oppression, racism and oppression. Resilience fatigue also, it's a chronic, sense of adversity and experiencing structural inequities, right? So I always want to put this thing here, this picture that is from New Orleans after Hurricanes Katrina and Rita. And it was this quote that says, "Stop calling me resilient, because every time you say, okay, they're resilient, right? They'll handle it. That means you're going to do something else to me. I am not resilient." So just to keep that in the back of our consciousness and understanding that where we may notice that strength in the struggle, ultimately we hope to help eliminate the struggle, so so you're not fatigued all the time. The last thing I'm going to say about this slide, and then I'm going to talk about moral injury, because this has really been on my last nerve lately. So racial or oppression battle fatigue. So a point here that is important to note in our work is so I opened this conversation today to say, I am a person who's lost not just my mother, but other loved ones as a result of substance use, right? So I come into this work, and I believe directly that had to do with her exposure to trauma and her exposure to racism. There was a direct link to her increased substance use. So I saw that as a child, as a young adult, and then in adulthood before she passed. So I come into this work with my lived experiences, my mother's lived experiences, people, behind me, right? When we uniquely identify with the people and communities who we serve, we can do phenomenal things. We can also, I want to introduce a counter narrative here, where often we can be together in community doing this hard work and simultaneously heal, right? We can also be healing. So there is a narrative of like, you have to have your stuff wrapped tight. Clearly, we have to be well and balanced and take good care of ourselves. But we live life, right? So we go through things, and you can be in this work and still be contributing in really beautiful, powerful ways while you practice reflectivity and while you access your supports, right? So you can simultaneously heal in this work, and you can also experience racial or oppression-based battle fatigue. And so, just introducing that, I just barely was in a conversation last week with a woman up north who, happened to be the only Black woman in this particular space, and talking about what it's like when you get the call of like, can you represent your entire culture, right? Like, can you, what it's like, what that lived experience was like for her in times of crisis or whatever, where she had to, respond to these pressures while also living through her own experiences and her own suffering. So that the idea of racial or oppression-based battle fatigue is when we experience the same racial and oppression-based stressors as the people and communities who we serve. And then, so that's just a little thing about racial battle fatigue. And then what I'm going to say, my final thing, and then I think we'll probably break. Oh, let me see what else is. We might do a couple of slides and then we'll take a break. But here's this idea of moral injury. So moral injuries, and I'm trying to figure out a different way to express this, but it kind of emerged actually from the military, which is partly why I'm trying to figure out a different way to express this concept. But the concept itself can be really powerful to understand out in community, which is moral injury is a different type of trauma. It's another type of trauma. And what happens when you have a shared set of traditions, values, beliefs, where you have a false sense of safety, that sometimes maybe happens at an organizational level where you feel like you're really well connected and really supported, and then someone within that space harms you. And what happens to your sense of well-being and safety when you have this perceived safe space and it gets violated, right? Or if you're pressed to do something that you don't agree with or you don't believe in by a person in a position of authority. And so I raise this because I haven't, and I believe it's directly correlated with the amount of stressors that we're dealing with. So let me give you a perfect example of moral injury. Let's just kind of sidestep and think a little bit about the narrative nationally around critical race theory and all of the sort of, I mean, just hardcore, like millions of dollars funded against critical race theory. It's like, it's just basically racial truth telling. And yet it's under, assault right now. And, I have, this is kind of a removed kind of example, but I have seen where people doing critical race work, were really well supported until it wasn't politically advantageous to people in positions of authority. And then those people poof disappear, right? They poof lose their job. That's one example, but in community, I'm kind of bringing it closer to home to us, where sometimes in this work, someone harms us, right? Or we experience direct racism from a person who we trust in a space where we should be feeling safe. And it creates a sense of unsafety. It creates a sense of fear. And then we begin to do this work from a fear-based perspective. And so, I'm enlivening that. So if you have a loved one or a colleague who's dealing with that, finding ways to be supportive to that person, because it is very, it changes the way in which we do the work, right? So, I'm putting that out there because it's a tough conversation, because it's the people who we care about doing the harm against us. And it can be really difficult in the work that we do to experience that. So just throwing that out there, just for folks to think about, because it's something I've been seeing on the uptick lately. So, okay, let's see what we got going on. What's our next slide? Oh, yay. Okay. So, hey, good timing. Good job, Nelson. I'm never on time. All right. So, okay, let's go ahead and take a 5-minute break. And then come back at, let's say, 10:07, and then we'll do our first breakout session. Okay. Thank you so much. Okay, I'll see you guys in a sec. Hey, everybody, welcome back. Okay, so just to give you a little orientation, so we've already made it through the first hour. We've got, just a little bit more time together, a couple more hours together. We'll take another break at some point. And this is where we're kind of getting into the little bit more reflective and practice-based work. And so I've asked for smaller breakout rooms, and the breakout rooms are going to be about 15 minutes in length. So that's going to give you a little bit of time to really delve into these questions and to kind of dialogue. So I always feel like I learn so much being connected with people and being able to talk through stuff. So actually, is there a way to drop this PowerPoint in the chat for folks? I don't know if it's too big to do that, but I was thinking maybe if folks needed it, maybe we could drop it in the chat. Okay, perfect. Okay, so folks are going to go ahead and drop the PowerPoint in the chat for you all. And then we also decided to go to post the questions to the breakout rooms. We're going to throw the questions into like a little announcement so that this way like about how much time we have and what the questions are going to be. And I really welcome and invite everybody to connect with each other and have and engage in this dialogue. Some folks, may feel a little bit more quiet, and that's okay. But just make sure if you're in a space and someone hasn't had the opportunity to speak, that you create that space for them to be able to speak. And then what we'll do afterward is every time we go into a breakout room, we're going to do a debrief, and I want to hear from you all about some of your thoughts. So we're about to go in to our first breakout room, and the questions that we're going to, so 15 minutes, right? Small breakout room. And the questions that we are going to ask is, we just got done talking about all these different types of collective traumas. And I want you all to explore what are some of the what are some of these collective traumas that you witness and see within the people and communities who you serve, and what's challenging in addressing these forms of trauma. And so really give everyone a time to reply, and then we're going to come back and kind of debrief and talk about it a little bit. I'm trying to post it in the chat here real quick too. Okay. All right. See you guys in about 15 minutes.
An invitation has been sent out and people are joining breakout rooms.
Awesome. Oh, I forgot to say that folks can come back if they get stuck. I forgot to say that part. If they have questions or.
We can broadcast it.
Okay.
I came in a little late. Is it possible I can be placed in a breakout room?
Yeah, I didn't get mine either.
Yeah, I see a couple of people.
And I came in on time.
You've been here the whole time, Joseph.
I'll fix it.
If it's helpful for folks, I have noticed that in the bottom of your Zoom screen, there should be a ribbon where you can mute, stop your video. All the way to the right, there's an option for more. And if you click that, it will show your breakout rooms.
Oh, that's helpful. And Larry, you had a question?
No, I was just saying I didn't get into the breakout group either, but
So we're trying to get Larry in. There we go. And then Jennifer, did you want me to go to room 3? Is there a question from room 3?
So I put both you and Andrea in the main room.
Okay.
You can decide which room you would like to go to. Everyone
I'll
else
hang out
has-
here and just let folks kind of talk.
Okay, sounds good. I'll go ahead and broadcast the
Okay.
question out. And I believe everyone has been assigned a room.
Great.
Mhm.
There. If anyone needs help joining, please feel free to ask questions. We can try and assist.
Hi, I was joining the majority of the meeting on my phone and then I tried to join a breakout room and it kicked me off for some reason, but I'm on the computer now. So if you want to, oh, there we go. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks for the question, Candace.
Larry? Did you receive the invitation? Could someone, Chris, note taker? Is that just,
That might, I'm not sure that that's a person actually. It looks like,
Hey, Larry, you should have gotten another invitation here. I just tried to send you another invitation, and Chris, note taker.
I will be removing.
Okay.
Okay.
Elena also?
They probably had stepped out and
Okay.
didn't accept to join a breakout room. That happened yesterday as well.
hey, I've got the break slide deleted. Looks like Larry's
Oh,
back.
thank you so much for doing that.
Sure, my pleasure. Hey, Larry, did you get kicked out of your breakout room?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry, I got kicked out of my internet's not working here at the office. So I had to jump on my phone.
Let's
I think I was on
Mhm.
16. I don't know if that's, I've seen the number 16. I don't know if that's. Yes.
Got
Thank
it.
you.
I'll put you back in.
Thank you.
Thanks, Larry.
The question has been broadcast.
Oh, thank you.
And I will also put there if anyone needs or has any questions to just raise their hand, request help.
Okay.
Great. I'm going to take the opportunity while we have this list of breakout rooms to take attendance really quickly here.
Okay. How do you think things are going so far?
I love the connection in the chat. That tells me people are really paying attention. And there's been
Yeah.
some good dialogue in there. I think it's going well.
Good.
How are you feeling?
Good. Good. I think we'll have, I don't know if we're going to do all 4 breakout rooms. Because I'm not sure. We still have, an hour and 45, but there'll probably be some dialogue when they come back too.
We can adjust, no problem. So if we get to a slide and it says breakout, but you want to skip, we can just move forward.
Okay.
Through. We can be totally flexible.
I think I'm going to look through this real quick and see.
I think that's always the challenge when trying to do a big presentation like this, is just getting a feel for the room and who's here and how they're engaging. So you can have like the best laid plans and then
Yeah.
to be flexible, and we totally understand that. So.
Yeah.
Jennifer, how are you doing?
Pretty good, pretty good. Behind the scenes, everything's running pretty well, smoothly.
Good. And how much, I didn't notice how much more time,
8 minutes.
8 minutes, okay. Hopefully this is deepening the content for them a little bit. It was really a struggle for me to figure out, like, exactly what, what I did last time, and what will kind of help to deepen the dialogue.
We have so many new folks, and I know, like, I personally really struggle with that when we're doing training. We do a training on the strategic prevention framework, and we always have a combination of people who are very well versed and have many years experience with the framework, and then we have people who are maybe brand new on the job and have never heard of the framework before. And so I think it seems like there's a combination of people who have been working in prevention for like many years, and then new people engaging in the chat. So I think that's great.
That's good. They have like the air conditioning blasting in my office right now. And I'm like, can't breathe. No, like it's like no moisture in the air at all.
It's not super warm out yet either.
No.
It's not in Santa Fe, so I just find that an interesting choice within our society to have, tolerable weather outside, and then to just
I know.
everybody
I agree.
inside. Like,
I agree. Yeah, I'm not because at my house I just have a swamp cooler, right? And for better or worse, that's all I've got. But like, one thing that doesn't happen is I don't freeze to death usually until today.
hopefully they turn it down or turn it up,
Yeah.
whichever way it's supposed to go.
Yeah. Yeah.
It looks like we have about 5 minutes left in the breakouts. Do we need to, I think, Jennifer, did you broadcast all of the questions?
I did.
Okay, perfect. Do we need to visit any breakout rooms? Or Dr. Nelson, would you like
Well,
to?
I'm not sure. I don't know. One thing that we could do is just say, if you're done with the conversation, feel free to rejoin the main room. And then end it at 15 minutes, if that makes sense. Pull everybody back at 15, but that might be a way for us to know if folks are done already.
I have a feeling with, they're big questions. And so I have a feeling there is dialogue. And I think it was a wise choice to have smaller breakout rooms. I think people tend to engage more when there's fewer people in a breakout. Yeah, good turnout.
3 minutes left.
Hey, attendance has been taken. Whew.
Yay. You guys do an incredible job at this. I really appreciate this. Has been really a wonderful experience.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. I couldn't do it without Jennifer. I think Jennifer's the real hero here in this room. Like,
Thank you so much, Jennifer, too. Yeah, because you're doing the tough stuff of managing all the sort of technology and stuff, which is awesome.
Oh, thank you guys so much. But yeah, it definitely takes a team. So thank you.
I feel like when we transitioned to remote work, we just learned so much. We kind of sat down as a team and really strategized, okay, what will it take to run a successful meeting? And we used to have 4 people in every meeting with a very specific role. And we've kind of boiled it down now to 2 because we're, I think, getting better at managing some of the technical pieces with
Yeah.
folks. I think a lot of that has to do with Jennifer's just incredible skill set and thoughtfulness. But we try to at least have 2 people in every meeting. Just
I think that's a good flow. And especially, one thing I've had happen to me before is where one of the co-hosts like drops off and if there's only like one, it's scary because it's like as a presenter, I'm like, uh-oh, I'm now the primary host and trying to manage all the stuff while, somebody's dealing with technology challenges. So I think having the both of you there to kind of balance things is good.
definitely helps too. I know we have you as co-host, so we have like 3 backups. Like we have 1
Yeah.
and 2 backups, which is nice.
Okay, breakouts rooms are closing.
We can also just do a process check with them when they get back to see how that time frame worked for them.
Oh, good idea.
Welcome back. Thank you for being here. Thank you, everybody. Welcome back. So I'm welcoming you back to this space. We got about 15 more seconds for folks closing out their conversations. So how did that time frame work for you all? Was that an adequate amount of time? You didn't feel like there was lag, but you also had enough time to speak? Yeah. Adriana, I'm seeing you're good. Carla, you said good? Okay. I think we're going to keep that flow up in our next breakout. So now I'm just really wanting to open the space up to hear what were some of your thoughts, and I'm particularly interested in hearing about what were some of your thoughts about the difficulties in addressing some of these traumas that you're observing out in community.
You gonna talk, Adrian?
I was in this one Zoom not too long ago, and there was like this gentleman who was in the Zoom, and there was like some wicked feedback, but it kind of sounded like a rap. And so it was the best. It was like the best way to start off a Zoom meeting, and it was crazy. It was really cool, but yeah. Zoom audio sometimes can be a trip. Okay, so I'm opening it up. I'm curious to hear, any big ahas or anything that you all notice, any commonalities too. So are you noticing the same type of collective traumas that folks are experiencing? And then what were some of the challenges you identified in addressing that? Valerie.
I just want to mention that I think that we had a really fruitful conversation. It was the perfect amount of time. We discussed collective trauma in different capacities, and we talked about like trauma from the past, and then trauma even from the present and the future.
Yes.
And what I found, and then addressing the whole like how to address these challenges was kind of a separate conversation that we wrapped up. But what Tone brought up was the trauma associated with the pandemic,
Yes.
you know, which I thought was really interesting because we're living in it in the present, and we're going to continue to experience this trauma moving forward.
Yes.
And like, yeah, how do what are the challenges associated with even addressing these things, and how do we begin to, you know, start to realize what these things even are and how to address them in the future. And then Anne, I believe her name was, brought up the idea of how to begin to address collective trauma in general. And she really advocated for like one-on-one sort of individual focused therapy in that way, because that's what's going to be most productive for a lot of these people, even though we're talking about, you know, something that's shared experience, identity, culture, and behavior. Like it does trickle down to the individual level, and then once we teach one individual how to overcome maybe some of these traumas, it can move forward in identity and culture as a whole. So that's what we had.
I know, Valerie, those are in your group, I think sounds like a powerful dialogue. So a couple of things come to mind right away for me as we think through collective trauma associated with the pandemic and its disproportional impact on particular communities, right? So, and I'm thinking about tribal communities, for example, and the loss of life and livelihood, and the inability to, practice ceremony or to grieve these losses. I think that's something that's really profound. And I think also just, we know the pandemic disproportionately, lives lost were disproportionately Black, Indigenous, Latina for Latin people, right? Like it, and so people of color had a differential set of losses, and were also, often more on the front line, financially and physically in terms of our work. So more at risk. So there's that sense of unsafety, right? Like that lack of safety associated with constantly being on the front line, right? And then the idea of individual ways to integrate this into individual therapeutic interventions is really important, but also thinking from a perspective of what does it look like to have dialogue out in community or in a group context that help people to see their lived experiences reflected in others, right? To that sense of validation of like, oh my gosh, I'm not the only one soldiering through this. So absolutely. So I see some here, Felix, you're talking about trauma related to, yes, pandemic and how it's affecting our youth at school. Oh my goodness. So this is why I'm saying it's intergenerational. This is going to last for a long minute of, what did social isolation do to development? What did social isolation do to an uptick in violence, right? And like, all of that I think is powerful. And then the trauma of generational poverty. Yes, I hear that as well. Carla, you had your hand raised.
Yeah, so just to let you know, this was great discussion. I think this is an awesome way to interact and to talk about shared experiences. So one of the things that somebody brought up, I believe it was Crystal, she was saying that when she provides Narcan training, she has had experiences where she's dealing with people who have lost a family member to substance use. So that's, I think we can all identify with is just that kind of trauma where you lose someone and that guilt of not being able to, that you didn't have this information to be able to help them. Yes. I know that I have that guilt in me, and I think that's one of the motivations why I love my job and be here is because I want to be able to educate my family and to be able to prevent, there's losing any more family members because of the lack of information. So just being able to identify with others and say, yes, I also lost a family member and I wish I could have done more.
Yeah. Oh, Carla, thank you so much for sharing that. And I'm sorry for the losses you've experienced. And also that's really real, right? Being out in community, listening. There's, people, you have people, we have the same lived experiences or similar lived experiences, and we're out in community hearing these things. And it's a thing that, often I found kind of weighed heavy on my heart, right? And so, there's more awareness around something called vicarious trauma, where we're out in community, where we're adjacent to human suffering, right? And then we kind of experience that ourselves alongside our own lived experiences. And that's where like that narrative of collective healing comes into play. We're going to talk about something called post-traumatic growth and resilience, and then vicarious post-traumatic growth, which is the witnessing of others' healing and how that actually promotes our own healing. So thank you so much for sharing that. And so last thing I'm gonna notice here in the chat, that something that came up for me is people setting their own traumas aside and going against another group. Oh, deep. Okay. So immigrants from Mexico turning against asylum seekers. Okay. So moral injury, this is what I'm talking about. So it manifests in a lot of different ways. Moral injury is another manifestation of that, is when you've experienced something similar and so a coping mechanism is to perceive yourself different from an even more marginalized group, right? And when I think about the sociopolitical context in which we exist right now, solidarity is survival. Solidarity is survival. And so, as I'm the way that I interpret what you said, Jessica, is that there's a group of people or an individual within a group who has experienced direct marginalization and is like, yeah, but you know what? I don't want to be them, right? Like I don't want to like associate or be connected to, I'm not them. And when you get to that and so then that, what is, so again, it's that idea of perceived safety. So if a person from that other more marginalized group is like, hey, you look like me, you've had a similar lived experience, you speak my language, I want to chill with you. Like, I just want to drop my guard a little bit. And then that person it shows bias or, shows, bigotry in any way, that's even more harmful in some ways, right, than what we can expect from certain systems of racism and oppression. It's even more harmful because you think, okay, I can just drop my guard for a second. So that's really, where this idea of moral injury is going for me, this idea that we need to understand that better. And we need to have these hard conversations, right? Like we really need to be like, let me call that out for what it is and the harm that could be created, right? And we're going to talk about intent versus impact as well. So kind of moving through now, and I just really want to thank and appreciate everybody for sharing. So we're at 10:37. So I was thinking we had all this time, and I want to, so there's really one breakout room that I really want us to get to, which is the actual action step breakout room. So I'm going to get us going back on some content, and then I might skip over some things because I really want to get, and again, you guys have these slides, they're there for you. And I'm always here, and I always love to hear from you all. So feel free to reach out, email, text, or whatever if you've got questions. But I do want to talk about something that is really present right now. And so I'm seeing a weird way that the slides are up right now, which is the presenter way versus the participant way.
Thank you. Let me try that again.
Okay.
How's that?
Yay. Okay. So I'm just going to share with you. So what we're easing into a little bit again is something, really present right now, which is the disproportional impact for Black, Indigenous, and communities of color, communities impacted by poverty, and something called the Global South, okay, which technically New Mexico is part of what's called the Global South, which is that the closer to the equator that you are, more often these are countries and spaces and communities that are not necessarily contributing to the pollutants that cause climate change, but are dramatically disproportionately impacted by the result of climate change. Okay, so I'm thinking like let's just do it like southern part of the US, right? We're talking like New Mexico, Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, like Florida, all the, thinking through the southern part and then south of that, right? Which is driving immigration. So, so what is happening presently and currently with the climate is driving folks to have to leave their ancestral lands, leave their homes, leave their families, to seek out food, clothing, shelter, basic things. And so I just want to kind of share that these all are very intricately linked. And I will say right now, this is the greatest task that we face, regardless of our discipline and the work that we're doing, because when we're talking about food scarcity, water scarcity, unsafe environmental conditions, environmental disasters, disasters that are person-made that result in environmental disasters, right? So it's just important to know that what's happening right now with environmental disasters, there is research to show clearly it's directly correlated with an uptick in substance use and a worsening of addiction. So two things, like substance use as self-medication and worsening of addiction. In one of the studies that I read in preparation for today that I found pretty interesting is when you experience a trauma like a natural disaster, it completely dysregulates your sense of, again, safety, right? And it also makes you doubt, can I handle big things like a natural disaster, right? So it affects your self-efficacy. And that's something we as practitioners can actually work on in terms of when we're intervening and we're working with someone impacted by an environmental disaster, we're able to say, you know what, look, you're standing with me right now because you made the choices you did. And that can include using substances to cope until you could receive help, right? Like really being able to uplift that self-efficacy. And let's think about new strategies and ways to cope with the grief, loss, fear, terror, trauma that you experienced associated with this environmental disaster. Okay, so next slide. So, I did want to just take a moment and a collective moment just of silence to honor the tremendous losses in Maui, Hawaii right now. So, loss of life, loss of, ancestral lands. And so I just wanted to just pause for a second. Thank you so much for doing that with me today. And I bring this into this space because, when I think about such a profound loss, it hits deeply and reminds us of, the fragility of life in our space. And it reminds us also that we are all in this together, right? And what is happening and what has happened is very powerful and something that will take, again, generations to heal from. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. And it also reminds us of what has recently happened here in New Mexico. And so, we had the fire in Jemez, right? In Jemez Springs, the Calf Canyon Hermit's Peak fire. So all of this resulted in evacuations, loss of homes. So, and also subsequent water shortage. So, I'm sharing this because this is becoming ever more our reality in terms of people's safety, and who are disproportionately impacted are people who are experiencing poverty, right? So I just, I mentioned I was up north recently, and I was listening to these stories of people impacted by the Hermit's Peak fire, and they were talking about, I didn't even know where to go. I was trying to find a hotel in Santa Fe and they jacked up their prices, right? Like when I hear that, and I think the human impact of, so this is a person, the person who I spoke to about that is a person with resources and finances, but still kind of hovering, right? Like just barely making it, and having to have all of this, having to have expend all this money, and you're worried about your house, you're worried about your animals, you're worried about your family, you're worried about all of these things. And then to have to deal with price gouging associated with this natural disaster is deep. So, and just most recently, we had the plastic fire that released harmful chemicals here in the air in Albuquerque. And so that was just this, this month. And so this is just becoming, again, ever a reality. And Michelle, yes, natural disasters absolutely do not discriminate. And then structural inequities, yes, contribute to the outcomes of what our families and communities are able to access. So developmental skills of our youth, Christina, yes. So, okay, next slide. Okay, so I'm going to make a link here. I'm going to do a little bit of a link to some of the other things that we're facing that are really profound. And and I'm thinking back to my days in the early 2000s when I was actually doing substance use intervention, and and I served excuse me, I served women and their families who were formerly incarcerated, and women impacted by substance use, right? And many of whom were pregnant, and many of whom lost their children as a result of state intervention because they tested positive. So, old school, back in the day, how things used to be done. However, the access to reproductive health looked differently, right? It looked differently than what it's looking like now. And so I wanted to evoke the words of Katsi Cook, who's a Mohawk elder. And this is always, this quote has always been really profound for me in terms of thinking about what this means in the context of decolonization. So women are the first environment. We are privileged to be the doorway to life. At the breast of women, the generations are nourished and sustained. From the bodies of women flow the relationships of those generations, both to society and the natural world. In this way, the earth, our mother, the old people, in this way is the earth our mother, the old people said. In this way, we are women and we are earth. And so, so this is what, this is, one among so many spaces that are unsafe right now. And so let's go ahead and go to the next slide. And so how does this relate then to the idea of sovereignty and the idea of decolonization? And so Katsi Cook, she continues to teach us about this, and she says, my idea of traditional encompasses all areas of sovereignty. And these include control over our land base, control over jurisdiction of that land base, control over our education, self-determination of our psycho-spiritual life, which directly links to the work that we do, and self-determination and control of our domestic health, which focuses on reproduction and continuous reproductions of the bodies of our culture. So, that gives us a foundation and some roots in how we start to think about decolonization. So it may feel overwhelming to think about all of these different areas that are feeling like a crisis. And we also, in that sense of overwhelm, always taking time to ground ourselves and to practice healing practices, because what we're facing as a collective right now is having to address many crises on many fronts, because they all intersect, right? They all intersect. And so when we stop attending to women's health, and we get distracted and we go in another direction, then that continues to perpetuate racism and oppression in ways, in very detrimental, hurtful ways, right? So I wanted just to ground us, or, when we stop thinking about the climate and what it's about to, do, or what it will continue to do moving forward, then we're not prepared to serve the families and communities who we serve. So I just wanted to evoke those words for us to consider, and then we'll go to the next slide. Okay, so this is the part, because I really want to spend like at least 30 minutes just diving deep in how we actually put this into play. So you're going to see a lot of words. I'm going to focus only on a few of them. I'm going to focus on especially cultural capital and community cultural wealth, and then I'm going to shift into some practices. And so let's go ahead and move forward to get to some of these practices. So there's a theory that I had the honor of developing in collaboration with so many across the state. So this is a New Mexico specific theory. It's a micro theory within critical race theory. It's called critical trauma theory, and we've kind of been learning about it already. But the idea is that we radically acknowledge that racism and oppression is an everyday occurrence, right? It's happening all the time, and that persistence creates risk for trauma exposure, but not it doesn't predict traumatic effect. Again, I want to evoke this idea that we will be exposed to trauma, and we also have resources for healing, right? So it also centers BIPOC and LGBT folks' lived expertise, cultural capital, and funds of knowledge as protective against racism and oppression and collective traumas, and promotive of healing. So that number 4 right there is really what we're focused on, and how we link that to decolonizing our practices. So next slide. And so this came from 2 IRB approved studies, and we'll go ahead and go on to the next slide. So here are some of the findings. Racism and oppression are happening, right? Like, surprise, the participants clearly stated, yes, we lived through this, right? We're going through this regularly. We're experiencing it in different settings. And that idea of moral injury, right? Like, we're experiencing it in settings where we should, in fact, be safe. Some of the powerful finding outcomes were, for example, our Indigenous First Nations participants reported very often experiencing feelings of physical illness associated with instances of racism, stress, anxious, angry, or depressed because of statues, pictures, or other imagery that reminds them of genocide or colonization, anxious about racial tensions in the United States, feeling hopeless that racism can change in the US. Our participants of color who also identified as LGBT plus, so they experienced, trauma associated with homophobia and transphobia. And there was a high preponderance of folks experiencing direct homophobia. So, this is why it's important to talk about that intersectionality, because that's what's happening out in community, and where we, may address a certain kind of thing, we're not maybe addressing the whole picture of oppression. So next slide. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and go to next slide. Okay, so this is what I really want to, spend some time. What is incredibly powerful about this is, so I keep talking about this idea of community cultural wealth and community capital and community cultural wealth. Why this is so important is randomly in education, this is talked about a lot more than it is in behavioral health and in the context in which we work, which is that people bring their lived traditions, their lived expertise, their ways of knowing, their identities. Always we're bringing this forward, and these are funds of knowledge that are often not acknowledged. And the way we think about it in behavioral health, kind of a crosswalk to behavioral health, is these are also funds of healing, right? So it's ways of knowing, and it's funds of healing, ways that we can heal by tapping into our identities. And so Tara Yoso introduced this in the early 2000s, where she talked about, who decides whose culture has capital, whose culture is considered valid. And what she shared with us is these 6 forms of cultural capital: aspirational capital, the ability to maintain your hopes and dreams in the face of adversity, right? And then resistant capital happens to be my favorite one. It's about the ability to speak your truth to power and to authority. So it's that sense of advocacy, that sense of, righteous indignation when you know something is not just, and being able to stand up against that. I see that all the time with adolescents. So I love that one. Linguistic capital, the ability to, to experience the world. So language is the seat of our emotions. And when we're able to speak our first language, that's how we express ourselves, So being able to be bi or multilingual actually is expansive in terms of your lived experiences with the world, but it also helps with things like problem solving and ways to, sort of navigate through things through the way you conceptualize stuff. So linguistic capital is really powerful. I'm going to talk about familial capital. Social capital is social capital. Folks know about that. But familial capital is so powerful because that's how we transmit knowledge across generations. That's how we learn from, lived experiences and what has worked. I'm thinking again in the context of healing, that familial capital is the sense of our knowing what is right, what is just, what it means to be who we are, what we want to transmit to generations moving forward. So it's so powerful. So familial capital is a capital that we can look to in terms of healing. I always want to preface that one because for some of us, maybe our families are not a safe space, or maybe we have lost our families. And so, thinking through ways in which you can talk about familial capital in a non-traumatizing way, right? Like being able to say, like, what do you remember? What were the messages that meant something to you, from an elder in your community? Maybe it's not someone you're directly related to, but that sense of passing down across the generations knowledge and ways of knowing and healing. And navigational capital is the ability to move through systems and institutions, including behavioral health institutions, smoothly, seamlessly, even when they were not designed for or by the community you represent, right? So that's a strength right there. And so when you're thinking about like this person coming to you and you're like, dang, Anna, I'm having a hard time like seeing a space where I see a strength or something, that they are standing in front of you, breathing, is a strength. And that's navigational capital. That you are able to connect with them at all, navigational capital. So it's a way to see that, regardless, that there is power in that person, moving toward healing. So what's really cool though, and I'm going to kind of look at, the ones to the side here, because the ones to the side are the things. So all of the participants unilaterally express cultural capital. And in New Mexico, we're seeing different types of cultural capital that other spaces may not be seeing. And that includes spiritual capital, ethnic consciousness, wealth, which is the experience that we have when we come together in solidarity with others who share our identities, and that sense of, we are here in community, in solidarity with one another toward a common goal or objective, which is really powerful. And then I'm going to switch over to Native capital, nation building, and Native resiliency. So these are three forms of capital that are so powerful. And the idea is that, for example, Native nation building, right? So focusing on nation building in the educational way, it's you're gaining knowledge to bring back to community, to bring back to your tribes and pueblos to actually improve conditions, right? And to support generations moving forward. So you take what you've learned traditionally and you bring new knowledge to support the sovereignty and thriving of your tribes and pueblos, for example, right? In the healing way, it's about I am engaging in this process of healing so that I can go back to my community and make a difference, and perhaps show others how to heal as well. So that's the way we translate that into behavioral health context, right? And so I'm going to move past the next slide and go to the following slide. Okay, so, here's an example. So these are, and I'm just going to focus on these two, this one and one other. So the pilot study was something called Photo Voice, which is actually something I use as a therapeutic tool as well. It's also a data collection tool. It's also an arts-based way to do research. And so I'm going to go ahead and just read this. And for some reason, I'm going to try to hold on, let me close my captions some kind of way here, because I'm going to try to read this for you. I don't know if I can move my captions. Okay. So one participant she shares with us, she's from the Mescalero Apache tribe. So she shares with us, we are a proud people. This quote and image in my community is very powerful because of the weight it holds. In acknowledging the various historical and current traumas that we as Apaches have faced, we continue to be proud of who we are and where we come from. These 5 powerful words are spoken from a former tribal president named Wendell Chino. The late Wendell Chino was the most respected and honored president on the reservation, whose significant work and powerful movements have not been outdone. Mr. Chino strived for tribal sovereignty, and unlike many presidents, he participated in all cultural and social dancing events, and never look down on anyone who is less fortunate. This mural is many years old, but like the abandoned building behind it, his words and positive outlooks still live in our tribe members to this day. So that is an example of Native capital, Native resilience, right? And we'll go to the next slide. So the participant offered a second collage of photos from the Mescalero Apache tribe. And here are the quotes, and I'll just quickly go through this. So this participant says, though these are bypassed every day, they are significant for many reasons. As Apaches, we honor artwork as a way to express ourselves and share the beauty of our culture in this way. These images serve as a reminder for our people to continue to honor our culture, as we're a very distinct tribe from hundreds of others. The image of the basketball reads Res Ball, as basketball has been an outlet for youth and adults and is a form of recreation many turn to in good times and bad. Basketball continues to bring the community together as well as to provide an outlet. So she continues. So in this way, she's demonstrating, she's evidencing this idea of cultural funds of knowledge, ways in which, resilience and healing can occur, even in the face of adversity. So I'm going to go ahead and we're going to skip the next slide. Okay, and we are going to also skip this breakout because I want to get to some of the skills, and I want to spend most of our time, the last 30 minutes or so, actually doing some idea formation and some action step, contemplating some action steps. So I perceive this work around decolonization at three different kind of levels, or like three different spaces. Levels is not really, but three different spaces: what we do inside ourselves, what we do at work, and how we transform systems, right? Like, so, I'm thinking about different spaces. And this first space is about the interpersonal work that it takes to actually engage in decolonizing. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So first and foremost, starting with a sense of cultural humility. So this has been getting a lot of like airtime lately, right? Like it's a little bit more, folks are familiar with it, right? And there are three core tenets. It's really about lifelong learning and critical reflectivity. And then it's about recognizing and challenging power imbalances. And finally, holding systems and institutions accountable for breaches, right? Of, so harm that's been committed. And I always say number three, that's kind of like a privilege. And I mean that to say people who can leverage the privilege of education, or can leverage, other privileges to have voice in a certain space, those folks are safe to hold systems and institutions accountable. And for those directly impacted by the type of racism and oppression that's being confronted, that may not feel like a safe space to do. So that's where we as community come together, and where the idea of collective care is really important, because we may have voice and space sometimes when other people don't, right? Literally, the three letters behind my name are to create a pathway for voice. That's all that is, right? It's to leverage that privilege to be able to speak when others may feel unsafe too, right? Or to create, or to hold that space for people who are feeling unsafe. So, I think about that a lot. And so the criticism about cultural humility is like, there's no how-to manual, right? And so I'm going to give you some how-tos, but it seems really simple, but it is a daily practice, and you really have to walk your talk in the ways that you exhibit cultural humility. So let's go to the next slide. So I give you some critically reflective questions in ways that, and so I want you to think about this slide and refer back to the slide when you go back to your communities and organizations, to think through, maybe even have a dialogue in your organization about how do we practice cultural humility? How do we make sure that voices are equally heard at the table? How are we identifying cultural capital and community cultural wealth among the people and communities who we're serving? So I want you to think about this slide as something that can be really useful moving forward. Okay, next slide. Also, I'm going to pause because I'm kind of rapid firing right now. So let me pause. Let me just see, anybody have any questions or thoughts about anything that I've shared so far? Anything particularly resonating for you all? Okay, I'm going to keep going and then we'll get to our activity part. So oops, sorry, let's go back one more slide. Sorry. So I mentioned this earlier in the dialogue, but I feel it's really important to share a different type of story about what it means to do this work, and that we as servants out in community, as community workers, as folks doing this work, we have feelings, right? We experience life alongside the people we're serving, and the different type of story I mentioned before is that we can heal through this work. We can harm through this work as well. And so it's always important for us to be knowledgeable about where we are in our experiences with vicarious traumatization. And and attend to our own well-being so we can promote healing in others, right? But there is this idea that just witnessing human healing, just being alongside someone who is healing is curative for us as well. It's healing for us as well. And I raise this in this space because I just want to remind us to be looking for those moments of celebration and those moments of healing in, even in like micro moments, right? Where you're like, ooh, I just saw a spark of hope in that person. That's powerful. And when you hold on to that, it brings so much more fulfillment in the work. And it also, again, helps us to heal and grow in this work. And the word for that is vicarious post-traumatic growth. And and I personally have experienced it, and it's what keeps me really engaged in this work. So next slide, please. Okay, so this to me, so earlier on, someone had asked for communication skills, right? This was a game changer for me because this is called intent versus impact. It is a communication strategy that has literally helped me get through so many critical conversations where I have noticed a thing that has been hurtful or harmful to me or someone else. And before I might think, I don't really want to get into it, right? I'm just waiting for that person to be like, well, that's not what I meant, right? Like, well, you took it wrong. It was just a joke, or whatever that person's response would be to me. And intent versus impact gave me the ability to speak my truth in a way that I never have in my whole life. And so I do want to pass it on to you. And it's a really simple thing. And it's different from like the I statement thing of like, when you did this, I felt like, because easily people will tell you, well, that's not what I meant, and discount that whole process. But instead, when you have experienced an act of racism or homophobia or sexism or a direct attack, or you're seeing it happen and someone isn't feeling safe to respond to it, you can utilize this basic statement, which is like, basically, we acknowledge that people don't wake up intending to be racist, right? Or intending to be a certain kind of way, but throughout the day, something happens and they commit an act that is harmful to someone else. And so you begin your intent versus impact statement by stating, I recognize your intention was not to be hurtful, harmful, racist. And that diffuses that whole, I'm going to just try to explain it away, or it didn't really happen. That whole gaslighting part of confronting racism, it kind of diffuses that whole process. Because really the intent of that person doesn't matter when the impact has been harmful. So you start out by saying, I recognize your intention wasn't to be X, Y, and Z. However, when you did X, Y, and Z, the impact it had on me or someone else was this. And in the future, I would like for you to do this, right? Super clear, super straightforward, no area for argument. And that to me has been, I have used it multiple times. So what happens if you're on the receiving end of an intent versus impact statement? Acknowledging the harm that's been committed is vital. And once you've done that, listen openly without defensiveness, and find a way to make amends, while also recognizing sometimes the harm that has happened is so intense, so impactful, you cannot make amends, and you have to accept that and learn from that experience, right? That simple. So this thing has been game changer for me, honestly. So I just wanted to share it with you all. So let's skip the next slide and let me see what's after that. Okay, so I just want to shout out to my dear friends and colleagues who had a opportunity to participate during our last conversation, and I want to acknowledge any harm or negative impact that my statements around collective care may have had, and so I want to just acknowledge and apologize for that, and want to just really pause and say, what I'm about to talk about is just one aspect of a whole spectrum of ways in which we engage in well-being. But it has been something that, so because we're in the space of talking about decolonization, it's important to say that the way sometimes self-care is presented out in the helping professions is it can be a colonized perspective of it. But the way in which you define self-care is valued and valuable, right? And so, I just wanted to start off this particular section by saying that, and to really uplift and support anyone's practices and definitions of self-care. It's really important because it is part of the whole continuum of being able to stay well in this work and to be able to thrive. And so, so collective care, so self-care, let's just talk about that. Self-care, so about like 15 or 20 years ago, one of my first presentations was this idea of beyond beer and bubble baths, right? And so I tell this story a lot. So I had a dear friend, Caprice Pino, and we were outside, and this was back in the day when I used to smoke 2 packs of cigarettes, like in a day. And I mean, I was chain smoking. Caprice didn't smoke, but she was, dying from my secondhand smoke at that point. And so we were outside, and we had just gone through a little self-care thing that was mandatory professional development. And I was outside, and I was like, man, I can't take this anymore. Like, if somebody tells me one more time, like, take a bubble bath and chill, like, as a way to quote unquote take care of myself, I'm going to lose it, right? Because clearly, like, that could be one practice among many that need to create a sense of serenity, peace, and healing. But it was so superficial at that time, and I still see that happening, where it's like people with affluence can access certain things that may promote their well-being, but folks in the work, in the struggle, may not be able to get like a regular massage, for example, may not be able to access, different healing practices. And so I want to just invite us to really think more deeply, continue to think deeply about, what does self and collective care mean for you? What do you need? And what do you need in relationship to your loved ones and the people who are important in your world? And so the idea of collective care is also that we heal in relationship with others, right? And sometimes we have this vast well of well-being. This happens, right? We're rolling along, we're doing, we're feeling, this vast wellspring of healing. And that's a time when we can reach out to others and be supportive, when we're well resourced. And instead of like asking, so another thing that was driving me bananas ever since NASW put self-care into our code of ethics, was people were starting to talk about self-care as an ethical. If you're not practicing self-care, then in some way you're practicing it unethically, right? Versus thinking about the structural barriers to practicing the self-care. And so I always just want to invite us to think about asking the question, instead of what are you doing for self-care? How can I support you in your well-being, today? And that's just one small step in a way that we can practice collective care a little bit differently. And also at the same time, always acknowledging that, when you're not well resourced, it's not your obligation to sacrifice yourself to support others, but instead, when you are well resourced, to share that with others, right? So that, that is a way to remain sort of balanced and well and on this trajectory of healing in this work. So I want to thank you for educating me more on ways that collective care can be perceived, and just really appreciate being able to share this about collective care. So next slide. Okay, and these are the things I always think about. These are the things that have, so, way back in the day, I used to talk a lot about this idea of radical self and collective care. Audre Lorde talks about like self-care as being, it's an act of resistance, it's an act of survival, right? And so I used to talk about this idea that it's radical to be able to take care of yourself or your family or your community. And I think, moving from a space of it being radical to a space of it being just part of our practices is really important. And I just call them the 5 C's. These are the things that bring me joy. Being able to be creative and really tap into that creativity, as well as being connected with people. Experiencing community in any way that I can means a lot. It really helps me to, for a period of, many of you know me, right? So for a period of, well, really more than 3 years, I experienced in my previous workplace, they shut down the place where I worked and I got moved to remote work. And it was like my soul died a little bit, right? Like it was really, really, really hard. And, I was blessed that my son came back home to live with me. But otherwise I would have been sola doing this work in my house 24/7. And that sense, one thing that I can tell you is that, so I had COVID in 2020 and it was a really bad case. I got sick every 3 months on the clock, like when I was working from home, right? Boom, boom, boom. I would get sick all the time. And in reflection, now that I'm no longer working just only from home and being out in community more and being around others of my loved ones and my friends and community again, what that has meant for me, just on the very basic level, is I'm not getting sick all the time. And why? It's because, when we're socially isolated that way, it impacts us. It impacts our mental well-being. It impacts our physical health. And in fact, social isolation, it foreshortens your life, like by years, right? By years. So when we think about the impact of COVID and social isolation and the pandemic, those are the kind of things we have to consider. Is that social isolation takes time to actually heal from, and it also has a long-lasting impact. So the other thing that thanks, Eric, great emoji. So the other thing that I always try to do too, and this kind of links to my humor, just because I like to laugh and smile and have fun. I try to find the celebrations in every little kind of thing, like, when can we uplift and honor somebody? When can we celebrate our own little wins here and there, like things that just like, dang, that really meant something to me in my life. I want to celebrate it. So practicing celebration is so important. Celebrating life, celebrating liberty, celebrating, sovereignty, celebrating the things that really mean something, celebrating the moments when wow, I was part of a healing process. Really celebrating that is important. And then ceremony in any way that looks like for you. So really practicing that. So we're going to skip over that next breakout. And then I'm going to do some, so I think we're going to be on time, you guys. I'm really excited. I think, yeah, I wish that like this hasn't been rapid fire. Like I never know. I just never know like how long stuff's going to take. And so I appreciate you just sticking with me for a few more minutes, and then we're going to take it down a notch and then get back into our breakout rooms and then come back together to create some kind of strategy, right? So the practice-based approaches, we're going to go through these relatively quickly, but these, and we'll skip that one, these literally have made a difference, and we'll skip that one too, made a difference in my practice. This is what I've seen promote healing. So all morning long, we've been talking about this idea of counter storytelling. Well, there's actually a technique for that. It's called testimonial. So I always want to be mindful of like folks' first languages, folks' literacy, like, never making someone feel uncomfortable if they feel uncomfortable reading, or always creating space for people to speak in their first language. So when I talk about these things, or I talk about reading a book or using a story or whatever, always know that there's ways to do this orally versus written, right? So testimonials are the telling of your story, the telling of really key aspects in your life that have made you who you are, right? That have brought you to the place where you are today. And then relating them. So, in some spaces, relating them to political action, or whatever in our space today, those key moments relating them to your process of healing, right? So testimonial is a tool that we can use in the work that we do with the folks we serve. So, and it also helps us to be able to tell different stories about, you may see me on the street and have a thought about who I am and where I come from. You know, you may hear the words that I speak and you may have an assumption about a certain kind of thing. Testimonial gives voice to your true lived experiences and tells a different story of the strengths and the resilience that you have. And so I'm a big fan of testimonials. You can do it. You can do a testimonial in spoken word. You can make it, you know, musical. You can, you know, there's so many ways that you can express testimonials. So, so that is a tool here for you all. And if you ever have any questions about what that looks like in a therapeutic context, just let me know. Okay, so next slide. Okay, so so I mentioned art. So you saw participants in that research study do something called photo voice. Photo voice is also a way for us to get information from people where they don't have to speak it. Where, you know, it helps us to understand and know their lived experiences more deeply. 3 of these photos are my own. These are photos I've taken here in New Mexico. And they deeply mean something to me. And so I always tell the story. So the photo in the right-hand corner, I don't know the artist. And this was a mural that was on 57th and Central, 58th and Central. Anyways, it's been painted over. And so I was so blessed to be able to capture that amazing art, right? Like I trekked through a field and I took that picture. But what you'll notice, it might be a little bit hard because the photo is kind of tiny. This photo means so much to me for so many reasons, because it reflects my community, it reflects my identity, it reflects my spirituality. But you're looking at a wall that is broken, right? And something, you know, imagery, right? Like you can think breaking down walls and barriers is one way to look at it. Or you can look at it, this symbolizes a space in my life that's still healing. There's lots of ways that you can use imagery to evoke something, right? But in the left-hand corner is a bullet chip, right? Like so this wall experience being shot at. And that speaks volumes, right? So this could be something that you could ask the people you're serving to go out and do in a way that they feel safe, to take pictures of things that mean something to them. And then you can have a dialogue about it and co-create meaning, or help to utilize this as a healing tool. So, you know, that's just one example of integrating art and creativity into therapeutic processes. You know, I also, you know, lots of talk about gratitude and practices of gratitude is something I believe in a lot, to notice blessings, right? And to notice, and to be able to appreciate and thank, you know, thank the creator, whoever is who, you know, whatever entity to which you are connected, for those blessings, right? So, so one thing that Photo Voice allows us to do is to snap an image of something that is like, whoa, like I just saw a moment of beauty, right? It keeps us mindful, it keeps us grateful. So it's just an example of a way in which you can bring different approaches. So it doesn't have to be cognitive behavioral therapy all day long, right? Like I mean, you get where I'm going with it. You can weave in things that people see their own identities reflected in those things. So that's just one thing. Okay, next slide. Okay, and then also, you know, people are banning books right now. People are doing a lot of stuff, and one of the things they're doing is banning books. So I happen to throw here this is not culturally reflective and expansive as I wish it would be. These are just ones that these are books that I've utilized in therapeutic contexts. You know, I might pull a little passage out of them, or I might, you know, when I've read them, they've meant deeply something to me. And, you know, and I've utilized them in, you know, teaching and therapeutic spaces. But there is an entire plethora of banned books out there that reflect resistance, resilience, reflect cultural capital, and any way that you can bring into your healing space things that reflect the lived experiences of those you're serving. It is so important and so meaningful. So, I'm a big proponent of if the literacy, if it's comfortable in terms of literacy, to utilize passages and things like that to evoke healing alongside people. So next slide. Okay. Still on time. So proud of myself. Okay. Sorry. So it's almost 11:30. We've almost got, we've got about 30 minutes left. I'm just gonna say this last little part of the presentation is about challenging some of the structures in which we do our work, right? So trauma-informed work, it's been around for a really long time. I, was a proponent of trauma-informed work in the early 2000s. The model hasn't really evolved too much. And so this is we're kind of in community evolving this right now, right? And the main thing, this comes from SAMHSA, CDC, and the main thing I want to just share with this image here is that you'll notice, and this, really gives the feeling like this was an add-on, right? You'll notice to the far right is gender, culture, so cultural, historical, and gender issues, right? As a way to frame trauma-informed responses, particularly in this case in community. So, the language right there, like, dang. Issues, and instead of thinking about cultural capital, community cultural wealth as well springs of healing, thinking of them from the perspective of issues. So I'm always like thinking about the subtlety of language, and so the next slide just shows what it could look like, and what applied critical trauma theory is really about, which is the ways in which we perceive safety. Safety is not just physical safety. It's about creating safe spaces culturally, in terms of your gender identity, in terms of your sexuality, creating those safe spaces cognitively, spiritually. Can you express yourself fully? Can you be fully in your skin and be who you are in this space? Because that's a healing space, right? Trustworthiness and transparency. One of the most important things as behavioral health providers is we have to earn that trust. It's not implied, right? Like it's not a given. Like we actually have to put the sweat into the work, right? To earn that trust, especially when time and time again, people have experienced people who reflect and represent systems as being harmful. So we have to earn trust, and so that's important just for us to acknowledge. And then I talked already about the idea of pathways to power, voice, and choice, and ways in which we can leverage our privilege as people who are educated in the space doing this work on our own healing journeys, right? Like all of that, there's elements of privilege that we can leverage to the people who we serve. And so let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So this was like whenever I read this, I was like, oh my gosh, this is crazy. And sometimes I just dream of stuff that we could have here in our communities. So I'm going to introduce you again. This is not new, but to see it in this way was for me at least so moving. So I'm going to introduce this idea of organizational cultural safety. I just barely learned about this not too long ago. And it started with a journey that I was in, whenever I was in my PhD program, and I was really honored to do this thing in New Zealand, not actually get to go there because it was during COVID, but I got to partner with folks in New Zealand. And I started learning about certain practices, and I wanted to understand more. And it brought me to this concept of organizational cultural safety. So the idea here, so it began again in the Maori culture. It's a systems approach institutionalized in New Zealand Canada, and also in Hawaii that honor Aboriginal and Indigenous First Nations peoples as traditional stewards of colonized land. So just explicitly at the organizational level. So that's just basic, right? Like that's just very, very important. And, you know, and like sort of the most basic that we need in order to create a sense of cultural safety. But it goes on further to talk about creating an environment that is safe for people where there is no assault, challenge, or denial of their identities, of who they are and what they need. It is about shared respect, shared meaning, shared knowledge, and experience of learning, living, and working together with dignity. So sometimes we have this implied at organizations, sometimes it's even written down, but to have it really institutionalized as the foundation and the bones of organizations, you know, to me is so powerful. And let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So the cultural safety, right? So it's about prioritizing. So this is the part, right? Like they start to get really excited. Prioritizing accountability for all people to provide cultural safety as defined by, I put here the client and their communities as measured through progress toward equity. It requires examining, confronting, and dismantling power imbalances. So again, you see that link to cultural humility. It promotes critical reflectivity, cultural humility, but at the organizational level, where we're talking, if you go into a performance evaluation, this is the stuff they're looking at, right? Like this is the stuff this is how they know you're doing your work correctly and well. Focused on transforming policies, practices, and organizational norms to center cultural identity, values, and beliefs, and considered vital to social, emotional, physical, and mental well-being. And so let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Okay, and so this is an actual, okay, this is the part that I was like, psh. So this comes from the Victoria State Government Department of Environment, Land, Water, and Planning. This is actually what they have in their actual practices. This is their model for cultural safety, accountability, respect, partnership, Aboriginal leadership, right? Aboriginal expertise, equity, and self-determination. And in the center, it says, these principles underpin our approach to developing culturally safe working environment for all staff. So I'm just sharing this to say, let's dream, right? Like let's really dream that this could be in not just our own community practices, but also in state organizations. It could be institutionalized in a way that really means something. So I'm just gonna pause there. Any feedback or thoughts about that? Anybody else get excited about that? I totally was like, no way, that's so cool.
And this is Angelica. I really appreciate all your information. It's just that sometimes I guess everybody's don't know how to express the feelings about this. But looking at these circles, I was thinking that it's kind of related to the golden rule, you know, that when we have to respect each other and not to steal and all those things. But I want just to thank you, you know, for showing all this to us, because sometimes we don't think, and that's my case. I only have like a year working as a program specialist in prevention, and this is all new to me in some way, but I'm getting really good ideas from your presentation that I'm gonna start using. We were just, I guess, I'm gonna say me and my part of my group thinking about how we gonna integrate these good books that you just show it to us. And because yes, we could do something with that information that I didn't think before, you know, like, this is a good way to grow my work in the community. And I really, really appreciate that. Like I said, another thing that I always having a reflection about it before, not this picture, but before that you were talking about different groups and discrimination, all that. There's a movie, I don't know if any of you already watch it. It's called Crash.
Yes.
I love the movie because it shows you different scenarios, why this person discriminate this other person, right? From a different race. But like you said, it's a reason why, from like a trauma from before, and everything starts like that, like maybe trauma. So, bad situations in your life that make you think like this group is bad. Is this, they're really mean. But we need to be more open-minded. I had a reflection also with a person in my group, in the break groups, about discriminating. And you said that you're part Latina too, but I was thinking, when I came from Mexico, I used to hear the Latino people saying that they feel discriminated. And I said, yeah, you may be right, but don't forget that when you were in Mexico, or in my case in Mexico, I'm not saying I was one of them, but I want to have a reflection that we also have indigenous groups in Mexico, and we discriminate them. So when you go back to Mexico for a vacation or with your family, think about it, that you feel like discriminated, but you may discriminate these groups also. So it's all a big reflection and so many things. And thank you for that.
Angelica, thank you so much for your words and thank you so much for sharing. And I'm just really grateful that you're here and also doing this work. And so, as I think about, so many things, right? Like this is just a space again for, for creating and thinking like innovatively. So, one thing that was recently told to me, I went to an organization, I did a presentation, and the organization leader said, well, we're already doing this stuff. And that wasn't maybe the consensus of the entire group, but the leader had this perspective of, we're already doing this. And that stopped the space of creating, right? And that just stopped cold the idea of like, could you possibly do things even more differently or even deeper, right? Like, can we take this a little bit more deeply? And so always thinking about ways in which we can be creative, and even when we're doing phenomenal work, maybe there are some of these concepts that can be continued to be integrated. So I just really appreciate your reflections. And what we're going to do is I'm going to go ahead and have the PowerPoint. Well, let's just close that thing down. And because we only have about 20 minutes together, I wanted would it be possible to show the ACCT guide or ACCT guided assessment just real quick on the screen, and then And then Eric, while they're pulling the ACCT, the Word document, while they're pulling that up. So those were just barely the things that I found. But I think I want to spend more time understanding organizational cultural safety, and, learning and just maybe sharing what I find. But I would just, I would look at organizational cultural safety like New Zealand, if you're curious, and we can, keep kind of thinking through that as a community together. But what I'm showing you here, so thank you so much for putting it in the chat. So this is a tool that I developed based on that theory, that critical trauma theory that I shared with you all. And it kind of blends. Remember, I was telling you about like the 3 little circles of individual practices, individual practices, what we do when we're serving people, and then what we can do at the organizational level. So, the practices that we do to serve others and the practices within the organization, right? So this assessment is so a couple of things I just want to put out there right away. First, I want to say this should never be used as a way to evaluate someone, right? Like, this is a reflective tool. It's a dialogue starter. It's a way to kind of, you can do it a couple of ways. You can do it for your own self to kind of look at your own practices. but it can also be done sort of in a little bit more of a group context, if that's safe, like within your organization, to actually move through this assessment tool, and share only what you felt comfortable, but to start evaluating the practices that are happening in your own space. And so if we go down a little bit, you'll notice, so if we go to maybe to page 2, so we start off with the personal practices, and then you have a way of just kind of gauging where are you, right? What have I done to apply critical trauma theory? Giving you like some examples of ways that you can put this into play and actually make a plan. And it even can be a plan to support your well-being, right? Your practices of self and collective care. There's a critical self-reflection, anti-racist, suppressive, self-exploration, being aware. So early on, I can't recall, I think it was a gentleman early on said, I want to look at my own biases, which is just super deep, right? Like we all have them. So this is a safe space to do that. And let's keep going down. And then it goes on a little bit more. And then you go with this is the professional. What are we doing in that realm of doing the work out in community? And then the final domain is at the organizational level. So let's go ahead and swipe this off the screen, and I just want to open it up to hear, kind of in our last 15 minutes together. I would love to hear from you all about even just one thing that really resonated for you in our dialogue today, that's immediately that you can take to the, I always say, take it to the streets, right? Like immediately that you can put it into action in your work from our dialogue today. And so I'm just opening it up for folks to say, this is an action step that I'm committed to doing, right? And Angelica, you did a beautiful job kind of starting us off with that, with some of your ideas as well.
There's a couple of things that I found really helpful in like immediately putting stuff to community work. And the intent versus impact statement is really great. I love that idea. And I think that it's going to take some practice moving forward. Just like, I don't know if any of you go to therapy and they start talking to you about the nonviolent communication type thing. Yeah. So I think that that's a really good tool. And then the 5 C's for radical self and collective care, like really putting it into perspective of how to take care of yourself and how to relate that, back to the things that are important to you, because we don't realize that. And I think that this needs to be taught not only in our sort of realm, right? Because we're very prevention based. We're very conscientious about wellness. But this is the first job that I've ever had that focuses on self-care as a priority. Yes. And I think that that idea needs to be spread throughout American culture more, because we're very much this like hustle culture. If you're not doing something, then you are worthless. If you're a woman and you don't have kids, you're worthless. If you're a man and you don't have a career, maybe you're a stay-at-home dad, you're worthless. Some of those sort of stigmatizing things. And I'm not saying that those things are true. Those are just examples that I can think of off the top of my head. But, the idea of being your best self is how you can take care of others most effectively. Yes. I think is a really great way to be introspective about those things and how you have that ripple effect from yourself out to your community. So thank you for those things.
Thank you, Valerie, so much. Thank you. Anybody else? I'd love to hear some of your, okay, so here's another point of contemplation. Maybe you heard all this and you're like, that's never gonna fly. Let's hear from you all too. Like if there are barriers or challenges that you feel like you may encounter in order to put any of this into place, let's hear about that as well. Christina.
Yeah, thanks. I think sometimes with this work and, we're just needing to think outside the box, generally speaking, as to what that means for community. And, just allow internally with the groups that I work with, we try to brainstorm, like, is it prevention that we're doing or not? But really, like, maybe it's just a wellness conversation and we build in prevention, because in my community, Latinos are like, prevention, substance abuse, they need to start with like wellness 101 and what that means. So anyway, sometimes just having this opportunity to, one, listen to this, and two, to explore options as to what that looks like, so that our communities can be receptive for the message. I mean, I've been on this soapbox for a couple of years that our communities are not ready to hear this sometimes, and the infrastructures aren't there, and we're just going to need a little bit more time for those deliverables, and to really, have some outcomes that can be tangible. Again, just generally speaking, but stepping outside the box and really, like, what does this mean to my community? How do I translate this? And not necessarily like in Spanish, but with symbols, with words, with with
code switch, right? Like it's like a,
Mm-hmm.
being able to take some of these things and help make it make sense at the community level, right?
Yeah. So just reflecting, and my brain is definitely, going as to how I can support this process on my end and in the roles that I, currently participate in. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I love that reflection. And you're kind of speaking really quickly, and I see you, Carla, you're kind of speaking a little bit, Christina, to the idea of time oppression and what happens when you're pressed, to create a deliverable. And that happens so often. So big funders press little funders, press community to produce and to like evidence and do all this stuff, right? And that's part of the oppressive structure in which we exist, right? So you're kind of enlivening, like, what does it look like to be authentic and to really, so when I talk about community engagement, I really mean, like, I'm talking about like years of building relationships, and none of that is funded, right? And so how do we do this work deep? When you build trust, you show up for years to spaces that, and you consistently practice, walk your talk, right? And that's how you earn trust over time. None of that is funded, right? So like how, that's a real, that's real talk. What I'm talking about, like, I acknowledge that this is the body of my career, and this is something, and how do you do that while also maintaining balance in your life, all this stuff, right? So, we have greater organizational and structural pieces that when we do this work authentically, those things need to transform in some kind of way. And when we are acting in solidarity, we can say, hold off, let's really be thoughtful instead of implementing a new kind of thing and everybody chasing after the funding. Then all of a sudden you got a new thing that's only going to last for 2 minutes in a community, right? Like, instead of doing that, what does it mean to come together in community, give space for that relationship building and often relationship healing, right? Because a lot of us have had to fight for the same pot of money for a long time. And that creates, historical wounds even between organizations. So that's a whole nother conversation that I could like go on for days about. There's this dream that I was talking about, this idea of organizational cultural safety. I have these dreams of what I would love to see even more of, not to say it doesn't already exist, but even more of in New Mexico. But there's some stuff that has to happen at the structural level in order for that fully to actualize, right? So I apologize for going on a little bit, and I want to turn it back over to Pamela. And then I feel like there was someone else too who had their hand up.
So Anna, I just want to appreciate the opportunity to sit, to grow you know, as a human being, you always provide that safe space. One of the things that I think is we talk about the exhaustion and the, you know, being in this field and existing in these structural places. And we always talk about, okay, we need to see big change by things happening at the top of the organization. But one of the things I just reflected upon and it hit me is, how have we continued to exist in these very oppressive, when you talked about moral injury versus the organizational cultural system, right? That safety, they collide immediately.
Yeah.
But I realized that sometimes those communities, or how we address it, is in a small community. Sometimes it's just 2 of us or 3 of us.
Yes.
Collectively are supporting each other on a journey of healing.
Yeah.
And by doing that, that's how we maintain this truth and authenticity.
Yes.
And solidarity.
Yes.
But it doesn't have to be a big community. We can do it in smaller communities and support each other until we wait for the rest to get there. So and I just realized that so many of you in so many different ways provide this community for me to heal, right? And we're doing it at the same time. We're serving and we're practicing and we're fighting for dollars and community. But it was just an incredible realization that we're going in this healing direction, even if it's not as a larger community, even if we do it in small communities, bits at a time. But thank you.
Oh, Pamela, I really appreciate being here with you, and you know, and what always I think about is I have rarely heard someone fully healing in isolation. Not to say it can't happen. But we heal, we innovate, we grow, we transform, we change, we learn, all in relationship. All of that stuff happens in relationship. And so I love that you're talking about, like, it doesn't have to be this big old huge thing. It can be just, one-on-one together, or, just being alongside someone. So thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate it. And I saw a couple hands go up, and then, oh, Carla, there you are. Hi. Oops.
Thank you. So one of the things that I was thinking about was, so I recently attended the NPN conference just last week. And one of the things that they really tried to emphasize was the importance of storytelling.
Yes.
And, how we can get to know other people that we feel so disconnected with by telling their story. So there was a lady there that gave a story of how when she was a little girl, she met Martin Luther King Jr. And so it was such a profound story that it was, just made you feel connected to her. So that made me think about what you were saying about how important it is to connect with people and get to know them on that personal level, just to be able to get to know them better. Because a lot of times I think that we have these ideas of what other people are like because of stereotypes, things that we've been told. We only see the negatives. Oh, they're different because, they're nothing like me. But once you actually connect with them, then you start to see things that connect you, things that you could share together. Oh my God, that happened to you. This is what happened to me. This is where we start to share trauma or oppression that we've both experienced. And yes, in very different ways. But now we can connect and say, look, you actually went through similar things that I did in different ways, but we have very similar feelings of how we felt oppressed.
Yes. And I really appreciate that. And, sometimes just sitting next to someone and saying, when you think about your life, what are, maybe 1 or 2 things that are the most meaningful things that you've ever gone through or that have impacted you. And even if you think about that question for yourself, like, what does that mean? What would you share if you were, if you were ever asked that question? That can really get to the essence of who that individual is and what they value and what has really influenced and impacted them, their, sense of connection and all of that. So I love storytelling, and I love telling the stories that no one's hearing, right? And that presents a picture completely different from people's assumptions. So Carla, thank you for sharing that. We are 2 minutes out from our closing out. We probably have time for one more. Is there anybody else? I see some amazing things happening in chat. So self and community care. I'm noticing. Let's see if my mouse will work. Okay. Yes, I love this. So any final thoughts before we close out for today? This 3 hours just flew by. So I just appreciate you all so much. And again, I'm here for, questions, or if you get out there and you're like, man, that lady said something and now I can't remember exactly what it is, feel free to reach out. So yeah. All right, everybody. I just want to wish you a very wonderful rest of your conference. And I'm just so grateful to have gotten this honor, really, to be with you all. And I look forward to connecting with you all soon. So take really good care, okay?
Don't say that, because I'm going to go and look for you so I could spend more hours in a coffee break.
Yes.
Really?
I would love that so much. Yes. I now have an office. I'm
Where?
legitimately out in community. So
Where's your office?
In Albuquerque on Indian School in San Mateo.
Oh, maybe go look for you one of these days. Just so
I
you
would
know.
love